Now that we have created the Alexa skill, let's work on the Lambda function next. Remember that if you provision your own Lambda function, you could use any of the programming languages available in Lambda, but in my case, I'm going to be using Node.js, JavaScript. And since this is a Node.js project, I'm going to start with npm init. Just going to press enter. Now the first thing I'm going to do is to install 3 packages. So I'm going to use npm install, and I'm going to save because I want this to be in the package.json. So npm install, I'm going to need ask SDK. So this is the SDK that we're going to use to develop the Alexa skill, the Lambda for the Alexa skill. Then I also need 2 other packages. One is called request. The other one is called request promise. So let me install this first. Now if I cat package.json, you see that we have the 3 dependencies, so which are the 3 packages that I just installed. Now let's switch to VS Code so we can start writing the Lambda. Okay, the first file that I'm going to create is going to be index.js. And this is going to be the entry point of our Lambda function. So right at the top, I need to declare a variable called Alexa. And I'm going to do require ask SDK. So that's how we're going to interact with the SDK through the Alexa variable. And you see that I use const, which means that this is a constant, so this is not going to change. But now I need another variable which is called skill, and I'm going to use let because I'm not going to assign anything to it yet, and I'm going to assign something to this variable later on. So that's why I'm using let. So let skill, I'm going to leave it like this. I'm not going to initialize the variable. Then I need to do exports handler. So this is going to be the handler that is going to be called, or the function that is going to be called when the Lambda is triggered. And this function is going to receive 2 parameters, so event and context. Let's initialize skill. So skill, it's going to get Alexa dot. So there is a function called skill builders dot custom. Then after that, we need to add request handlers. I'll explain what a request handler is very soon. And we're going to put a couple of values here. But for now, I'm going to leave it empty. And then after that, we're going to do dot create. So that's how we initialize this variable skill. Now, the way Lambda functions work, whenever your function is triggered, AWS will bring up a container to execute your code. If your function is not triggered often enough, the container with your code will be shut down, so you don't have to pay for a running container that is not doing anything. However, there are instances where AWS will keep your container running, just waiting for your function to be triggered again. Here on line 6, we're creating an object and assigning this object to the skill variable. That's what will happen when the container comes up. But if the container is shut down, next time your function executes, we'll recreate the object. So that's very simple. Now, if the container keeps running and we trigger our function again, the variable skill will still reference the same object, meaning that we don't have to recreate the object. So the idea here will be to only create this object and assign to the variable skill if skill is not set. So what I'm going to do here is at the top, I'm going to do if not skill, which means if the variable skill is not set, then we'll create the Alexa skill. Otherwise, just don't do anything because it's already referencing the object. So if not skill, which means if the skill variable references nothing, so okay, create that. Then once we have the skill, what we need to do is we need to get the response. So const response, and then we're going to do skill dot invoke, passing the event and the context. And the thing here is that even though usually JavaScript would do things asynchronously, every time I try to use asynchronous calls with the Alexa SDK, it doesn't work well. So we're going to be using this relatively new feature from Node.js, which is async and await, which means that I'm going to wait for this to execute before I can continue move on. And this might sound funny for other languages, because other languages, that's what's going to happen, right? If you're using Python, for example, you're going to wait for the request to come back and then continue your code. It's very natural. But Node.js, when it was created to be asynchronous. But a lot of times that gives you a lot of headache. So I guess that's why they came up with this. So we can do await here. And whenever you do an await, the function that is actually being called, which is the handler, you need to declare as an asynchronous function. So again, because inside this function here, we have another function call, which is skill.invoke. So that's a function call. And this function call, we want to wait for it. So that's why we put the keyword await. The outside function, which is this, we need to declare this as an asynchronous function. So if you don't know Node.js and you're not understanding, don't worry too much. Just know that by doing this thing, I'm gonna wait for this function to finish, return the response, and then I'm gonna continue. That's it. So after I get the response, I'm just gonna return the response. Okay, so the bare bones of our function is already done. Now let's take a look at the request handlers. Remember that in the previous video, we created intents. So basically an intent, when you create in the Alexa developer console, translates to a function here in my JavaScript code. And that's a handler. So back there I had the deploy intent plus a few other intents, which means that the deploy intent in the Alexa console is going to translate to a function here, which I'm going to be calling the same, deploy intent. And just so we don't have everything in a single file, I'm going to create another file called handler, or handlers, because there are going to be more than one. So handlers.js. Let's start with one of the most important request handlers. So I'm going to do exports, and here I'm doing exports because I need to be able to access this variable in the index.js. So I'm like exporting a variable. So exports dot, I'm going to call it launch request handler. And the launch request handler for Alexa is when you open your application with the Alexa device. So if I say Alexa open deployment manager, this function is going to be executed. So this is when you launch the application. This is going to be an object. So I'm going to do like this. Then I need two functions. One of them is can handle. So I'll explain a bit what it is. And this gets a parameter called handler input. Actually, it doesn't matter the name, but I'm just call it handler input. And all I'm going to return is return handler input. And so this object that is going to come as a parameter, it has something called request envelope. So envelope. And this request envelope object contains the request type. And the request type needs to be launch request. So all I'm doing here is I'm making sure that this is actually a launch request before we actually handle the request. So that's function number one. Now function number two, which is the most important one, is the handle function, which is the one that is going to be executed if this is a launch request. And the same way I need a handle input or handler input. First thing I'm going to define is what Alexa is going to say to me when I ask to open this application. So when the application is launched, what Alexa is going to say to me. So I'm going to create a variable for that called speech text. And here we can say anything we want. So I'm going to say welcome to deployment manager. Manager. We can say the coolest deployer out there. All right. So every time I say Alexa open deployment manager, Alexa is gonna say this. Then what I need to do, I need to return handler input. So you can see that handler input is a very important variable. We do pretty much everything with it. And we have a response builder. So this is to build a response. Then if we want Alexa to say something to us, we have the function speak. So speak, and then you pass what Alexa is gonna speak. So I have everything in my speech text variable. And after that, I just call get response. Get response. And that's it. Very, very simple function. Now let's go back to index.js and I'll show you how we can use this request handler. So let me copy the name because I need to know the name exactly. And back here where I have add request handler, I'll just put the variable there. And of course I need to import it first. So I can do const launch request handler, receives require, and it's a file which is at the same level. So there it is, /handlers. Let's go back and write the other handlers.